He arrived to claim her father's debt. She stepped forward, offering herself, saying, "Don't kill him." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun had barely risen over the small, dusty town of Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the modest homes and wagons that dotted the landscape. The air was thick with tension, and the dust seemed to settle uneasily, as though even the earth was holding its breath. On the porch of the Whitmore house stood Clara Whitmore, staring at the horizon. Her heart raced as the sound of horses' hooves grew louder in the distance. She knew what this visit meant. The man who was coming was no stranger to her. Jake "Blackjack" Morrison, the ruthless outlaw who had terrorized the region for years, had come to collect. He was not a man who took no for an answer, and when he made a promise, he always kept it. Clara's father, Samuel Whitmore, had gambled away everything, including his daughter's future. His debts had piled up over the years, and now, the time had come for Clara to pay. The money was long gone, and what was left to offer was Clara herself. Her father had been broken long before the final hand had been dealt. Now he stood inside, nervously pacing, his face pale as he awaited his fate. Clara knew he was too proud to beg for mercy, but the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden porch railing. She could hear the voices of Morrison's men as they rode into the yard, their laughter echoing in the air like a cruel reminder of her helplessness. They had no intention of negotiating. They were here to collect, and Morrison would not leave until he had what he wanted. A surge of anger and fear rose in Clara's chest, but she knew that showing any sign of weakness would make the situation worse. As the men dismounted, Morrison, a tall, imposing figure with a scarred face, stepped forward. His cold eyes locked onto Clara's, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. "I came for what's owed to me." Morrison's voice was low, menacing. "Your father's debt is long past due, and there's no more time for excuses." Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing for a way out, but there was none. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest like a boulder. Her father's life was at stake, and there was only one way to save him. She took a deep breath, stepping forward, her legs trembling beneath her. The men watching her, including Morrison, were taken aback by her sudden move. "Don't kill him," Clara said, her voice shaking but steady. "Take me instead." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. Morrison's eyes narrowed, studying her closely. He was used to seeing fear in the eyes of women who were desperate to survive, but there was something different about Clara. The way she stood, the resolve in her voice. It was not the typical pleading of someone trying to save themselves. "You're offering yourself to me?" Morrison asked, his voice filled with a mixture of surprise and amusement. Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no illusions about what this meant. She knew the danger of making such an offer to a man like Morrison, but she also knew there was no other choice. If she didn't do this, her father would be killed, and their family would be torn apart. She couldn't let that happen. The tension in the air was palpable as Morrison regarded her for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, he spoke, his tone cold and deliberate. "You think I'll spare him for your sacrifice?" he asked, stepping closer. Clara did not flinch, even as his shadow fell over her. "You will," she said firmly. "I will do whatever it takes to make sure you don't take him." Morrison chuckled darkly, clearly amused by her courage. But Clara saw something shift in his gaze, something deeper, a hint of respect perhaps, but also something more dangerous. "All right then," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You've made your choice. But know this, nothing comes without a price. And I don't take kindly to being made a fool of." Clara nodded, her heart racing. She had just made a deal with the devil, but she was willing to do whatever it took to save her father. Now, she had to prepare for the consequences of her decision. Clara stood tall, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest, as she looked into Morrison's cold eyes. His men, who had been eyeing her with contempt and amusement moments ago, now stood still, waiting for their leader's command. The tension in the air was thick, but Clara did not falter. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes scanned her face, looking for any sign of fear or hesitation, but he found none. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she awaited his response. The silence between them stretched, making the world outside feel far away. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Morrison finally said, breaking the stillness. His voice was low and dangerous, like a snake coiling before striking. "But don't think for one second that this makes you any more valuable than your father." His words were like a knife to her heart, but Clara stood her ground. She had known the risks. She had known the danger she was walking into. But her father's life was on the line, and she would not let him die because of the debts he had accumulated. Morrison's men exchanged glances, their faces a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Clara could see the skepticism in their eyes. They were used to seeing women beg for their lives, but this woman was different. She was not begging. She was offering herself in place of her father, and that was a concept they could not quite grasp. "What's your name, girl?" Morrison asked, stepping closer. The smell of tobacco and leather filled the air as he loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Clara Whitmore," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Morrison raised an eyebrow, as if considering her name, and then nodded. "Clara Whitmore, you're a brave one, but bravery alone won't keep you alive in this world." Clara swallowed, trying to steady her breath. She had heard the rumors about Jake Blackjack Morrison, how he had burned down entire towns, how he had killed without hesitation. He was a man who took what he wanted, and right now, he wanted her father's life. She had no illusions about what Morrison would do if he didn't get what he wanted. "I'll keep my word," she said, her voice ringing out in the silence. "I'll stay. Let him go." Morrison studied her for a moment longer, then gave a nod to one of his men, signaling for them to release her father. Samuel Whitmore, the man who had brought her into this world, the man who had gambled away their future, was now free to live, thanks to his daughter's sacrifice. But even as Clara watched her father stumble to his feet, a sense of unease settled in her gut. She knew that her actions had only bought them a brief moment of respite. There was no telling what Morrison would demand next. "Get on your horse, Clara," Morrison ordered, his voice cold and final. "We're leaving." Without hesitation, she turned and followed him toward the waiting horses. As she mounted her steed, her heart heavy with uncertainty, Clara couldn't help but wonder if she had just made the worst mistake of her life. Morrison was not a man to be trusted, and yet, she had just placed herself at his mercy. The ride was long and quiet, the sound of hooves echoing against the dirt road as they made their way out of town. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead, but her mind raced with thoughts of what the future would hold. What had she done? Was she truly ready to live with the consequences of her choice? As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Clara knew that her life had just been irrevocably changed. She had saved her father, but what would she lose in the process? Would Morrison keep his word, or had she just traded one kind of slavery for another? As the darkness of night settled around them, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a storm, and there would be no escaping its fury. The journey had been long and arduous, stretching out for miles across the desolate plains as the sun sank lower in the sky. Clara Whitmore had not spoken much since leaving Dry Creek, her mind clouded with 1,000 questions and doubts. She had made the choice to save her father, but now, as the landscape rolled on endlessly before her, she couldn't help but wonder if it had been the right one. Jake Blackjack Morrison rode ahead, his dark figure a silhouette against the fading light, his stoic silence unsettling. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the ground ahead, the rhythmic sound of hooves beneath her steadying her nerves, but her thoughts refused to quiet. She had never imagined her life would lead her here. She had spent her years on the farm, helping her father with the land, dreaming of a future beyond the rough edges of the small town. But now, her future seemed uncertain, bound to a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm on the horizon. She had given herself to Morrison to save her father's life, but she feared that the price for that decision would be far greater than anything she could have imagined. The hours passed slowly, and the cold began to creep in as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the open land. Clara's heart beat faster with every passing minute. What would happen once they reached Morrison's camp? What kind of life would she have there? She had heard the stories, of course, stories of how Morrison had burned down entire towns, of how he had killed without hesitation. She had no illusions about his nature, but it still seemed impossible to comprehend the full extent of what she had gotten herself into. She had offered herself as a sacrifice, but what had she truly signed up for? As the group slowed their pace, Clara looked around, taking in the vast emptiness of the landscape. The land stretched endlessly before them, a barren sea of grass and dust. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the dry grass, carrying the faintest scent of the coming winter. She shivered involuntarily, and for the first time in hours, she spoke. "Where are we going?" Morrison's voice was cold and distant as he answered. "To a place where you'll be safe." Safe. Clara's mind immediately recoiled at the word. How could she be safe in a place ruled by a man like Morrison? She had heard enough about him to know that safety was a fleeting concept in his world. She glanced at the men, riding alongside them, each one a hardened outlaw, their faces obscured by shadow. They said nothing, their eyes fixed ahead, as though they had all accepted the unspoken truth of their existence, survival at any cost. But Clara wasn't like them. She wasn't one of them. Her life had always been about preserving the little she had, the family she had fought so hard to keep together. But now, she had surrendered that to save her father. She felt a strange mix of guilt and defiance rise within her. It was as if she had willingly walked into the mouth of a beast, knowing the danger, but unable to stop herself. The camp came into view as they crested a small rise in the land. It was a small cluster of tents and fires, a crude settlement tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Clara's stomach tightened at the sight. This was where she would spend her days now, surrounded by men who had no interest in her beyond what they could take from her. As Morrison dismounted, Clara followed suit, her legs stiff from hours in the saddle. She could feel the eyes of the men on her, their gazes cold and calculating, like wolves sizing up their prey. She stood still, trying to steady her breath as Morrison approached one of the tents, his movements deliberate. "This is where you'll stay," he said, his voice flat. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she stepped into the tent, the reality of her situation began to set in. There was no escaping this. She was here, with no way out, and no one to turn to. But she couldn't let herself break. She had made a promise to her father, and now she would have to honor it, no matter the cost. She would survive this, somehow. She would endure. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of laughter and shouting from the men outside. Clara lay on the thin blanket that had been provided for her, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She had no idea what the days ahead would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She would not let herself become another victim of Morrison's world. She had already given him her body to save her father's life, but she would not give him her soul. The next few days were a blur of silence and tension. Clara remained in the tent, her every move watched by the men who wandered in and out of the camp. She knew they were all curious about the woman who had given herself to Morrison, and she hated the feeling of being scrutinized like a prized possession. Her mind constantly drifted back to her father, wondering what was happening back in Dry Creek. Was he safe? Was he angry with her for what she had done? Did he understand why she had chosen this path? Clara had no answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She had made a sacrifice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Morrison, on the other hand, seemed unconcerned by the arrangement. He came to her tent only when he needed something, his presence as cold and impersonal as ever. He never spoke to her with any warmth, and Clara began to feel like a shadow in his life, something to be used when necessary and forgotten when not. It was the silence that weighed most heavily on her. No one in the camp spoke to her, except for a few casual exchanges when food was brought to her. The men treated her with disdain, as if she were no more than an object, a debt repaid. And Morrison, despite his promises, gave her no comfort, no reassurance. One night, as Clara sat by the fire, she caught a glimpse of Morrison across the camp. He was speaking to one of his men, his hand resting casually on the handle of his gun. He looked like a man who had lived his life in the shadows, a predator, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had made the decision to stay, but now she wondered if it had been the right choice. Her mind raced as she stared into the flickering flames, her thoughts clouded by fear and uncertainty. Just then, Morrison's voice cut through the stillness as he walked over to her. "Clara," he said, his tone flat. "I need you to come with me." Clara hesitated for a moment, then rose from the fire. She had no choice but to follow him. As they walked, the night air was cold and biting, and Clara's breath came in short, nervous bursts. She followed Morrison to the edge of the camp, where the horses were tethered. "Get on the horse," he ordered, his voice as cold as the wind. Clara did as she was told, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. As they rode out of camp, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea where they were going, but she knew it wasn't good. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape as they traveled deeper into the wilderness. The sound of hooves echoed in the silence, and Clara could feel the tension in Morrison's posture as he led the way. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small clearing. Morrison dismounted and tied his horse to a tree. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice stern. Clara remained seated on the horse, unsure of what was coming next. She had no idea what Morrison had planned, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was about to unfold. As Morrison disappeared into the darkness, Clara scanned the surroundings. The trees loomed tall and ominous, their branches swaying in the wind. The silence of the forest was deafening, and Clara could feel the weight of the night pressing in on her. Moments later, Morrison returned, holding something in his hand. It was a long, sharp knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. "You'll help me tonight," he said, his tone colder than ever. Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Morrison's eyes narrowed. "There's a group of men who owe me something, and tonight I'm going to collect." Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew that Morrison's version of collecting was not going to be pretty. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't do it." Morrison's gaze turned icy, and he took a step closer. "You'll do what I say, or your father's life means nothing. You're mine now, Clara. Don't forget that." His words struck her like a slap to the face, and she knew he wasn't bluffing. She had already given herself to him to save her father, but now she was being forced to take part in something she didn't want. Clara's heart raced as she sat there, struggling to find a way out. She couldn't let Morrison make her his instrument of violence, not after everything she had already sacrificed. But what choice did she have? "I'll go," she said quietly, resigning herself to the inevitable. Morrison smiled, his expression one of cold satisfaction. "Good girl." Clara swallowed hard as they rode off again, deeper into the forest, her mind filled with fear and doubt. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross. The road ahead was filled with darkness, and she had no idea how long she could continue down it without losing herself completely. Clara's heart pounded as she rode beside Morrison through the thickening forest, the shadows stretching long under the moon's pale light. The knife in Morrison's hand gleamed coldly, and Clara's stomach twisted with dread. She had agreed to come, knowing what it might mean, but now, as they approached the hidden clearing where Morrison had planned to confront his enemies, the weight of her decision pressed down harder than ever. The tension in the air was palpable, and Clara could feel it tightening around her chest, making it harder to breathe. Her mind raced as she tried to prepare herself for what was to come. She had no choice but to follow Morrison, but deep inside, a small voice told her she couldn't let this night define her. "Stay close," Morrison ordered, his voice low and harsh, breaking the silence of the forest. Clara nodded, her hands gripping the reins of her horse tightly. The cold wind blew through the trees, and the sound of hooves was muffled by the dense underbrush. As they reached the clearing, Clara could see the faint outline of men gathered around a campfire, their voices hushed as they spoke in low tones. The air smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, and the flickering light from the fire cast strange shadows on the men's faces. Clara's eyes scanned the group, and her stomach twisted with anxiety. She had never seen these men before, but she knew that they were not friends of Morrison. She could feel the danger in the air, thick and suffocating. Morrison led the way forward, his hand still resting on the handle of his knife, and Clara followed closely behind. As they neared the fire, one of the men looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw Morrison approach. "What's this?" the man asked, his voice rough. Morrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around, his gaze sweeping over the group, as if assessing the situation. The other men shifted uncomfortably, some standing and others staying seated, their hands resting near their weapons. Clara's pulse quickened as she realized that this was not just a meeting, it was a confrontation. "I'm here to settle a debt," Morrison finally said, his tone cold and final. The man who had spoken before stood up, his hand hovering over the gun at his side. "You're not welcome here, Morrison. We have no debts to settle with you." Clara felt a chill run down her spine as the tension between the two men grew thicker. She could sense the animosity in the air, a simmering anger that was about to boil over. Morrison took a step forward, and the man's hand moved to his gun. Clara's heart raced as she braced herself for what was about to happen. "You owe me, and it's time to pay up," Morrison said, his voice unwavering. The other man sneered, drawing his gun in one swift motion, but Morrison was faster. The flash of the knife was like lightning, and before Clara could even process what had happened, the man was on the ground, blood seeping from the wound in his side. A gasp of shock spread through the group as the remaining men took a step back. Clara stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. She had known Morrison was dangerous, but she hadn't expected this level of brutality. Her hands trembled as she clutched the reins of her horse, unsure of what to do next. The other men stood motionless, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Morrison wiped the blood from his knife with a rag, his eyes cold and calculating. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice low. "You don't cross me, and you don't make deals behind my back." The men exchanged glances, clearly intimidated by Morrison's power and ruthlessness. Clara could see the fear in their eyes, and a small part of her wondered if they would all submit without a fight. But she knew better than to think that this would be over so easily. "You want your money?" the man who had been standing closest to Morrison asked, his voice shaking. "It's not about money," Morrison replied coldly. "It's about respect, something you clearly don't understand." The man hesitated, then slowly pulled out a pouch of coins from his belt. He threw it to the ground at Morrison's feet, his eyes avoiding the outlaw's gaze. "Take it," the man muttered. "Just leave us be." Morrison bent down and scooped up the coins, his eyes never leaving the men around him. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that was impossible to ignore. "Next time, I won't be so lenient." The men nodded quickly, not daring to speak, and Morrison turned on his heel, motioning for Clara to follow him. Clara's legs felt like they might give way beneath her as she dismounted from her horse. She had witnessed the violence that Morrison was capable of, and a part of her felt sick to her stomach. She had saved her father, but at what cost? As they walked back to the camp, Clara could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on her. She had made a choice, but the consequences of that choice were beginning to feel too heavy to bear. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, and Clara didn't know how long she could live in the shadow of the man who now controlled her fate. The days that followed the confrontation in the forest were filled with a suffocating silence. Clara woke each morning to the same bleak routine, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. The camp had settled into a grim, quiet existence, with Morrison keeping to himself more than ever, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. Her only interaction with him was when he gave her orders, which she followed without question, afraid to provoke him further. It was on the fourth day after the confrontation that Morrison spoke to her again. They had just finished a sparse meal, the fire crackling low in the center of their camp, and Clara was cleaning her hands with a cloth when he approached. His eyes were cold, calculating, as usual, but there was something different in his expression this time. "We're moving out," he said abruptly, his voice devoid of emotion. Clara looked up at him, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had grown accustomed to the oppressive stillness of the camp, but now, with this sudden shift, she was uncertain of what awaited them. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Morrison's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "None of your business," he replied, his tone dismissive. Clara swallowed her response, knowing it was pointless to press him further. She had learned that much in the days she had spent under his watchful eye. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was usually to issue a command, not to offer explanations. She gathered her few belongings, the weight of them feeling heavier each time she moved them. As she packed, her mind raced. Where was he taking her? What was his plan? Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being dragged deeper into a world of violence and cruelty, and she had no idea how to escape. The ride was long and grueling, the landscape stretching on endlessly, with no sign of civilization for miles. The terrain grew more rugged as the hours passed, the sun beating down relentlessly, until even the wind felt like an assault on her skin. Clara sat tall in the saddle, trying to keep up with Morrison's pace, but exhaustion gnawed at her. Her muscles ached, and her mind was clouded with doubts. She had made a sacrifice to save her father, but now, as the days wore on, she was beginning to wonder if she had made a deal with the devil himself. Morrison didn't offer her any reprieve from the discomfort. He rode ahead, always leading the way with the same grim determination. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to give directions or make demands. The men in the camp treated Clara with indifference, as if she were nothing more than an object to be moved around at Morrison's will. The further they traveled, the more Clara felt herself slipping into a quiet despair. The road was long, but the emptiness of it seemed to stretch on forever. And still, there was no sign of escape. One night, as the camp settled down for the evening, Clara found herself alone by the fire. Morrison was nowhere to be seen, and the men had retreated to their own tents. Clara stared into the flames, her mind wandering to thoughts of her father. Was he still alive? Had he forgiven her for making such a drastic choice? She had saved him, but now, she was trapped in this world of violence, with no clear way out. Her thoughts were interrupted when Morrison suddenly appeared at the edge of the camp. His silhouette was framed by the firelight, and for a moment, Clara couldn't read his expression. "Get up," he ordered, his voice as cold as ever. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping for a moment of peace, but it seemed that Morrison had other plans. She stood slowly, her body sore from the long ride. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him into the darkness. Clara hesitated but obeyed. As they walked away from the camp, the night air grew cooler, and the silence between them grew heavier. Clara could feel the tension in the air, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. They walked for what felt like miles, the only sounds the crunch of their boots against the dirt and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, Morrison stopped, turning to face her. "You've been obedient," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But that doesn't mean you've earned my trust." Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't sure what he was getting at, but the unease in his tone made her wary. "I've done everything you've asked," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "And I've kept my word." Morrison's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, and for a brief second, Clara thought she saw a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps? But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice low and final. "You'll have to prove yourself." Clara's heart sank. What did he mean by that? Was this just the beginning of a never-ending cycle of violence and cruelty? The uncertainty was unbearable, but she had no choice but to follow him. She had already made her sacrifice, and now she had to survive whatever came next. With a heavy heart, Clara nodded, knowing that her path forward would be far from easy. She had no way of knowing where this road would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to find a way to survive, or she would be consumed by the darkness that surrounded her. Clara felt the weight of Morrison's words press down on her as they walked deeper into the dense forest. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the quiet was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The stars above seemed dimmed, their lights swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Clara's mind was racing, trying to make sense of the cryptic message Morrison had just left her with. "Prove yourself," he had said, but she didn't know what he wanted from her, or why she had to prove anything at all. Hadn't she already sacrificed everything for him? Was this not enough? She glanced at him, his silhouette tall and unmoving ahead of her, his demeanor as cold and emotionless as ever. The further they walked, the more her unease grew. The promise of safety she had once clung to now felt like a distant memory. She had traded her freedom, her life, to save her father's, but now she was no longer sure of anything. The weight of the decision she had made sat heavily on her chest, and the road ahead seemed darker than ever. Finally, Morrison stopped. Clara stumbled slightly, catching herself before she could fall. He didn't turn to look at her, but she could sense that he was aware of her every move. "This is where you'll prove yourself," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what he meant, but the feeling in the pit of her stomach told her that this moment would change everything. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled his gun from its holster and checked it, as if preparing for something. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't what she had imagined when she had agreed to stay. "You'll see," he finally replied. He motioned for her to follow him into the deeper woods. Clara had no choice but to obey. She followed him cautiously, her every step measured, each one echoing in the stillness of the night. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. She couldn't help but feel as if she were walking straight into danger. After a few minutes, they came to a clearing. In the center was a small, rugged campfire, surrounded by a group of men. Clara recognized them, some of the outlaws Morrison had been traveling with. They were sitting around the fire, their faces partially illuminated by the flickering light, their eyes watching her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Morrison stepped forward without hesitation, his presence commanding the attention of the group. "This is Clara," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "She's here to prove herself." The men shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what Morrison meant. Clara could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their stares making her skin crawl. She could sense the tension in the air, the unspoken judgment that surrounded her. She had no idea what Morrison was asking her to do, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The largest man in the group, a rough-looking fellow with a thick beard, stood up and walked toward her. His expression was hard, unreadable, but Clara could feel the hostility emanating from him. "Prove herself, huh?" he muttered, looking her up and down. "What exactly does that mean, Morrison?" Morrison's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "It means she'll do whatever it takes to earn her place," he said, his tone dark and final. The man grunted and turned away, muttering under his breath. Clara's heart was pounding now, her palms sweaty as she stood there, unsure of what to do next. She had no idea what Morrison had in mind, but the way the men looked at her, the way they judged her, it felt like she was already failing. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. Morrison stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a strange intensity. "I want you to prove you're not weak," he said. "Weakness won't survive here." He gestured toward the fire. "You've been sheltered your whole life, Clara. You don't know what it's like to live out here, to survive by any means necessary. If you want to earn my respect, you'll have to show me you're willing to do what it takes." Clara felt a rush of anger surge through her. She had given up everything to save her father, to make sure that he wouldn't die in this man's hands, and now it wasn't enough. She had to prove herself, not just to Morrison, but to these men who didn't know her, who didn't care about her. But as the anger flared, a deeper, more dangerous feeling began to take hold. She wasn't just angry at them, she was angry at herself, for putting herself in this position in the first place. "I'm not weak," she said, her voice firm, the words coming out with more confidence than she felt. "I've already proven that by being here." Morrison's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "We'll see," he said. "You'll get your chance soon enough." He turned to the men around the fire. "Make sure she understands what it takes to survive. She'll need it if she's going to make it here." Clara stood still, her body tense as the men turned their attention to her. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. This was no longer about saving her father, no longer about making a deal. This was about her own survival, and she was beginning to understand that it would take everything she had to make it out of this alive. Clara's heart raced as the men around the campfire turned their attention to her. The firelight flickered in their eyes, casting long shadows across their faces, and Clara felt like an animal caught in a trap. Morrison's words echoed in her mind. "Prove yourself." She had thought she had already done that, but now it was clear that the path she had chosen was only beginning, and it was far darker than she had imagined. The man with the thick beard, the one who had been eyeing her with contempt, stood up and approached her. His presence loomed large, and Clara instinctively took a step back, her body tense, preparing for whatever was coming next. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. "You think you're tough, huh?" he asked, his voice thick with disdain. "Think you can survive out here, among men like us?" Clara met his gaze, trying not to show the fear that bubbled in her chest. She knew that if she faltered now, it would be over. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter the cost. "I'm not here to prove anything to you," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I'm here because I have no other choice." The man grunted, clearly not satisfied with her answer, but he didn't push further. Instead, he turned and motioned to the other men gathered around the fire. "Let's see what she's made of then," he said, his tone heavy with malice. "You're gonna need to learn fast, girl, or you won't last long." Clara's stomach churned as the men stood up, encircling her. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment, the understanding that she was nothing more than a game to them, a challenge. The fire crackled between them, the light flickering in their eyes, and Clara's breath hitched as she realized just how out of place she was in this cruel world. One of the men, younger than the others, stepped forward. He wasn't as big or as intimidating, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made Clara's blood run cold. He handed her a small, rusted knife. "You're gonna need this," he said, his voice low and almost mocking. Clara took the knife, the weight of it cold and unfamiliar in her hand. She had never used a blade like this before, but she knew that she had no choice. It was survival. She looked back at the man who had handed it to her, her jaw set. "What do you want me to do with this?" she asked, though she had a feeling she knew exactly where this was going. The younger man smiled cruelly. "Show us you can defend yourself," he said. "If you want to stay with us, you'll need to prove you can handle a fight." Clara's stomach dropped, and she felt a surge of panic, but she quickly swallowed it down. This was the moment. This was her chance to show them that she wasn't weak, that she wouldn't just lie down and take whatever they threw at her. The larger man with the thick beard stepped forward, grinning at the challenge. "Come on, girl. Let's see what you've got." Clara's hands shook as she gripped the knife tightly, trying to steady her breath. She had never fought before. She had lived a quiet life, a life of hard work, but nothing that had prepared her for this. Yet, as she stared at the men around her, the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. There was no going back. She had to fight, or she would be nothing more than a victim. With one last deep breath, Clara lunged forward, the knife aimed at the man in front of her. She swung with all the force she could muster, but the man easily sidestepped, his laughter filling the air. "Is that all you've got?" he mocked, his voice rich with amusement. Clara's face burned with shame, but she didn't stop. She had to keep going. She swung again, this time catching him off guard, and the tip of the knife grazed his arm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Not bad," he muttered, but his tone still carried the same condescension. Clara's heart raced as she circled him, trying to find an opening, trying to stay focused. The other men watched, their eyes fixed on the fight with a mix of curiosity and indifference. This wasn't a real fight to them. It was a test, a game. But to Clara, it was life or death. With each move, her body screamed with exhaustion, but she pushed on. She couldn't afford to stop. She couldn't afford to show weakness. The man lunged at her, his fist coming down hard toward her face, but Clara managed to dodge it at the last second, her instincts kicking in. She thrust the knife forward, catching him in the shoulder this time, and he staggered back, cursing under his breath. For the first time, Clara saw something shift in his expression, respect. The men around the fire were no longer laughing. They were watching her now, their faces unreadable. Morrison stood in the background, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on Clara. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she could feel his gaze like a weight pressing down on her. The large man with the thick beard nodded slowly, the cruel smile on his face replaced with something else, acknowledgement. "You're not as useless as I thought," he said, his voice rough. Clara didn't lower the knife. She didn't relax. She knew this wasn't over yet. The men around her were still dangerous. They hadn't decided whether she was worthy of their respect, and until they did, her life was still hanging by a thread. But for the first time since she had arrived in this hellish camp, Clara felt a flicker of hope. She had proved herself, at least for now, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. The days that followed Clara's fight for survival felt like a never-ending stretch of tension. She had earned the respect of the men in the camp, but she knew it was only temporary. The weight of Morrison's expectations hung over her, a constant reminder that nothing would be easy in this world. The men had stopped mocking her, but their indifference was just as suffocating. Every day, she woke to the same routine. Keep her head down, follow Morrison's orders, and try to stay out of the way. But deep down, Clara knew she couldn't keep going like this forever. Her mind was constantly searching for an escape, a way to break free of the hold that Morrison had on her. She had saved her father, but now, in this grim reality, she felt more like a prisoner than ever. One evening, as the camp settled into an uneasy silence, Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The fire crackled, its warmth providing little comfort. She had barely spoken to Morrison since the fight. He had not congratulated her, nor had he acknowledged her bravery in any way. He was a man of few words, and the silence between them had grown thick with unspoken tension. As Clara sat there, lost in her thoughts, Morrison appeared beside her. His presence was as imposing as ever, but for the first time, he didn't look like the cold, distant figure he usually was. His face, usually unreadable, seemed to show a flicker of something. Was it regret? Clara couldn't tell, but something in the air had shifted. "You did well," Morrison said, his voice low. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected more silence from him, more of the same indifference. But this small acknowledgement caught her off guard. "Is that all you came here to say?" she asked, her voice harsher than she intended. Morrison's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond to her tone. Instead, he sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "I wanted you to know that you earned your place here," he said. Clara felt a sharp sting in her chest. Earned her place. What did that really mean? Was this some sort of twisted game to him? Was she just another pawn in his world? "I'm not here because I want to be," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Morrison didn't reply immediately. He stared into the fire for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reluctant. "I didn't force you to stay," he said. "You made that choice." Clara looked at him, trying to read his expression. His words were simple, but they carried weight. "You made that choice." It was the truth, and Clara knew it. But the truth didn't make it any easier to bear. The decision to stay had been born out of desperation. She had given herself to Morrison to save her father. But now, every day that passed in this camp felt like a piece of her soul was slipping away. The realization hit her like a wave. She had not just sacrificed her future, she had sacrificed herself. And for what? To survive? To stay alive? What was the point if this was the cost? The silence stretched between them, and Clara could feel the weight of her own thoughts crushing her chest. She wanted to ask him why he had taken her in, why he hadn't just let her go. But she knew better than to ask. She knew Morrison didn't answer questions like that. He didn't know her explanations. And yet, something in her refused to let the silence linger. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Morrison glanced at her, his eyes cold and unreadable. "I want you to keep your word," he said simply. Clara swallowed hard, the reality of his words sinking in. She had kept her word to him, but she was beginning to wonder how much longer she could live by his rules. "And what happens if I can't?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Morrison didn't flinch at the question. He simply stared at her, his gaze unwavering. "Then you'll be like the others," he said. "Expendable." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she might choke on it. Expendable. She had known, deep down, that this was always the way things worked with men like Morrison. To him, people were tools, useful until they weren't. And when they weren't, they were discarded. Clara's eyes dropped to the ground, unable to meet his gaze any longer. She had fought to survive, but was survival really enough? The fire crackled between them, its light casting eerie shadows on the ground. The cold wind rustled through the trees, and for a brief moment, Clara felt the weight of the world closing in on her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. But was this really the life she had chosen? The life she wanted? She had no answers. Only questions, endless questions, and no way of escaping the darkness that surrounded her. "I'll do what it takes," Clara said finally, her voice steady, though her heart ached. "But I won't be like the others." I won't let you break me. Morrison didn't respond, but his silence said everything. He didn't have to break her. She had already broken herself. And now, all that was left was to survive. The days seemed to stretch longer with each passing moment. Clara's mind felt like it was unraveling, every thought weighed down by the choices she had made. The camp had settled into a grim routine, each day blending into the next, a series of small tasks and quiet moments where Clara's thoughts wandered to darker places. She had survived Morrison's test, fought to prove herself, but with each passing day, she felt more like a ghost in his world, invisible except when he needed her. She had given up everything to save her father, but now that the immediate danger had passed, the price she had paid for that salvation seemed steeper than ever. Her days were filled with hard work, chopping wood, cooking, cleaning, but it was the nights that haunted her. When the fire flickered low and the camp grew quiet, the weight of her choices settled heavily on her shoulders. She had made a deal with Morrison, and there was no going back. She could feel his eyes on her more often now, the silent judgment in his gaze, the lingering presence that made her skin crawl. He had kept his word. He had spared her father, but now she was left to face the consequences of that bargain. She didn't know how long she could endure this life, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to find a way out, or she would lose herself entirely. One evening, after the others had gone to bed, Clara found herself alone by the fire. The moon was high above, its pale light casting an eerie glow over the camp. She stared into the flames, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the night. She hadn't spoken to Morrison all day, and the silence between them had grown heavy, suffocating. She could feel his presence in the air, even though he was nowhere to be seen. The thought of him, the way he controlled everything, the way he took what he wanted without a second thought, filled her with a mix of fear and anger. She couldn't deny the power he held over her, but deep down, she knew she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep being a pawn in his game. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned, her heart leaping in her chest, but when she saw who it was, her breath caught. Morrison stood at the edge of the firelight, his dark figure casting a long shadow on the ground. His eyes were cold, unreadable, but there was something about him tonight, something different. "You're still awake," he said, his voice low and measured. Clara didn't answer immediately. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she had the strength to argue or even speak her mind. But she wasn't going to remain silent anymore. She had made her choice, and she had to live with it. But that didn't mean she had to remain passive. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling with the words she had kept hidden for so long. Morrison didn't respond at first. He just stared at her, his gaze unwavering. She could feel his scrutiny, the weight of his silent judgment, and it made her heart race. "You made a choice," he said finally, his tone flat. "A choice you'll live with." Clara stood up, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I know that," she snapped. "But I didn't know what I was choosing. I didn't know what kind of life I was signing up for." Morrison's lips twisted into a faint, humorless smile. "You think you're the only one who had to make hard choices?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Clara flinched at the bite in his tone, but she didn't back down. "I didn't choose this," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she had intended. "I didn't choose to live like this, under your thumb, doing things I never thought I'd do. I made a choice to save my father, but now I'm trapped. You think I don't know what I've given up? What I've lost?" Morrison's expression darkened as he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You think you're the only one who's sacrificed everything? You think I'm the only one who's had to live with the consequences of my actions?" Clara swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know what he was trying to say, or why he was making her question everything she had done. "I'm not here to make you feel better," he said, his voice cold again. "I'm not here to hold your hand. But you made your choice, and you'll live with it, just like I've had to live with mine." Clara's breath came in short bursts, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the ache in her chest, the emptiness that had taken root in her soul. She had saved her father, but now she was left with nothing but the haunting memory of what she had sacrificed. "I'm not like you," she said finally, the words coming out in a whisper. "I didn't choose this life. I didn't choose to become this." Morrison's eyes flickered, a hint of something softer in them, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. You think you're better than me? He asked, his voice low, almost mocking. Clara took a step back, shaking her head. No, she said, her voice barely audible. I just don't want to lose myself. Morrison didn't speak again. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Clara stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had no answers, no clear way out, but she knew one thing. She had to find a way to survive. She had to hold on to whatever was left of herself, or she would be lost forever. Clara woke to the sound of distant thunder rumbling across the plains. It wasn't the storm that made her heart race, but the realization that the storm was coming in more ways than one. The camp had been quiet for the past few days, almost unnervingly so, but Clara knew that the peace was only temporary. The men, including Morrison, had been quiet, their eyes rarely meeting hers. It was as if they were all waiting for something, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for the next test. But Clara had already proven herself once. She had survived Morrison's game, and she wasn't about to let them break her now. The fire flickered low in the center of the camp as Clara rose, pulling her blanket tight around her shoulders. The morning air was crisp, but it did little to clear the fog of her thoughts. She had made her choice, but as the days went on, the weight of that choice grew heavier. She was trapped, caught between the man she had saved her father for and the woman she had once hoped to be. The firelight danced in her eyes as she prepared a small breakfast, the crackle of the flames reminding her of the tension in the air. Every glance, every whisper, seemed to carry the weight of an unspoken judgment. As Clara worked in silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison was watching her. His presence had become a constant shadow, and though he hadn't spoken to her much, she knew he was waiting for something. She could feel it in the air, the expectation, the tension. Just then, Morrison appeared, walking toward her with his usual purposeful stride. His face was unreadable, his expression as cold as the early morning air. He stopped in front of her without saying a word, his eyes studying her with that same calculating gaze that made her blood run cold. We leave today, he said, his voice flat. Clara didn't respond at first. Her heart sank as she thought about what lay ahead. Where are we going? She asked, her voice steady despite the unease rising in her chest. Morrison didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and began to walk away, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Clara hesitated for a moment, then followed him. As they rode, the world around them seemed to shift, the silence between them growing heavier with each mile. The land stretched out before them, an endless sea of dry grass and distant mountains. It was the same desolate landscape they had crossed before, but today, it felt different. The air was thick with the promise of something to come, something that Clara couldn't yet name. She had grown accustomed to the long, solitary rides with Morrison, but today, the silence felt suffocating. The wind whipped at her face, but it did nothing to cool the heat building inside her. She wanted to ask him more questions. Where were they going? Why was he taking her? What did he expect from her? But she knew better than to speak out of turn. Morrison didn't tolerate questions, especially not from someone like her. The hours dragged on as they rode deeper into the wilderness. Clara's thoughts wandered to her father. Was he safe? Did he ever think about her? Or had he already moved on with his life? She had given up everything for him, but now, she was starting to wonder if it had been worth it. Morrison didn't offer any reassurance, didn't say anything to ease her worries. He was a man of few words, and those words were often as cold as the winter winds that howled through the mountains. By the time the sun began to set, they had reached the edge of a small, hidden valley. It was a place Clara had never seen before, its rugged terrain surrounded by jagged cliffs. As they dismounted, Clara felt a shiver of apprehension run down her spine. There was something about this place that felt wrong, like a trap waiting to close around her. Morrison turned to her, his face unreadable. "This is where you prove yourself again," he said, his voice low. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped, naively, that perhaps she had earned a reprieve, but now, standing here in this strange, isolated place, she realized that nothing in Morrison's world was ever easy. Nothing was ever enough. "Prove myself?" she repeated, her voice a little more forceful than she had intended. "What do you want from me this time?" Morrison's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of something in them, something that could have been regret, or perhaps satisfaction. You'll see, he said. He turned and gestured toward the edge of the valley. Clara followed him, her mind racing with possibilities. As they approached the cliffside, she saw a small group of men gathered around a fire, their faces obscured by the shadows of the night. They didn't look friendly. One of the men, a burly figure with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward as they approached. She's here for the test? He asked, his voice gruff. Morrison nodded. She'll do what's necessary, he said. Clara's stomach twisted. She knew what this was. This wasn't a test of strength, not like before. This was a test of loyalty, a test to see if she would truly belong in this world, a world of violence and survival at any cost. The scarred man's eyes studied her with a mix of curiosity and disdain, and Clara could feel the judgment in his gaze. We'll see if she's really one of us, he muttered, and Clara's blood ran cold. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to be more than just a pawn in Morrison's game. But as the firelight flickered around her, Clara realized she had no choice. She had made this bed, and now she would have to lie in it. There was no turning back. No more running. She had to survive this, no matter the cost. Clara stood still, her heart racing as the scarred man's eyes bored into her. The air felt thick, charged with an unspoken challenge, the crackling fire casting an eerie glow over the small group of men surrounding her. They were waiting for something. She didn't know what, but she felt their eyes on her, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. Morrison stood slightly behind her, his presence like a shadow she couldn't shake. He hadn't said a word since they arrived, just watching her with that same cold detachment. The scarred man stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry ground, his face twisted with disdain. So, this is the girl who thinks she can be one of us, he sneered. Clara didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only showed weakness. I didn't ask to be here, she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. But I'm here now, and I'll do what I have to. The scarred man smirked, then turned to the others. We'll see about that. He motioned for one of the other men to step forward. A tall, broad-shouldered figure who carried a long, thick rope in his hands. Clara's stomach twisted. She could already sense where this was going, and her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew better. There was no escape. Not now. The man with the rope came closer, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Without a word, he stepped behind her and roughly tied her hands together. The rope was coarse and biting against her skin, but Clara didn't let out a sound. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Morrison remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He was still watching, like a wolf observing its prey. Clara didn't know if she was disappointed or relieved that he wasn't stepping in. This was his world, after all. She was just a piece in his game, and she had to play by his rules. What's the test? Clara asked, her voice low but clear. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, and he stepped even closer. You'll see soon enough, he said. Then, turning to the others, he motioned toward the edge of the camp. Take her to the clearing. The men grabbed her arms, pulling her forward with force. Clara's feet stumbled over the uneven ground, but she didn't resist. She couldn't. The air was thick with anticipation, and her mind raced, trying to predict what was coming next. They reached a small clearing, empty except for a few scattered boulders and the thick trees surrounding them. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a pale light over the scene. The men stopped, turning to face her. This is it, the scarred man said, his voice like gravel. We'll see if you've got what it takes to survive. Clara stood still, confusion and fear bubbling up inside her, but she held it down. She wasn't going to show weakness, not now. Not in front of them. One of the men stepped forward, holding a knife in his hand. You're going to fight him, he said, pointing to the largest of the men, a towering figure with a thick beard and scarred hands. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't ready for this. She had fought before, but this wasn't the same. This was different. This was a test of survival. The man with the knife stepped closer, his cold gaze locking with hers. If you survive, you prove you belong here, he said, his voice filled with a sick amusement. If you don't, well, you're not worth our time. Clara's heart pounded as the man with the knife moved toward her. Her hands were still bound, but she could still fight. She had to. She had to survive. The towering man stepped forward, his large hands raised, ready to strike. Clara's pulse raced as he lunged toward her, but she dodged, narrowly avoiding his grasp. She couldn't waste any time thinking. She had to act. With all her strength, she swung her body to the side and kicked out, catching him in the knee. The man let out a grunt of pain, but didn't stumble. He was too strong. But Clara wasn't backing down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. She took a deep breath, readying herself for the next strike. She didn't know if she could win this fight, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to die without a fight. The man lunged again, and this time Clara saw the opening she needed. She dodged to the side, her hands straining against the rope, and with all her force, she kicked him in the side. He grunted, but this time he staggered. Clara didn't hesitate. She charged forward, her body fueled by desperation and survival. She tackled him to the ground, the weight of his body crashing into the dirt beneath her. For a moment, everything was still. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart pounded in her ears. She couldn't believe what she had just done. She had taken him down. She had survived. The men around her were silent, their eyes wide in surprise. The scarred man stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Not bad," he muttered. Clara's breath was still heavy, but she didn't let herself relax. She wasn't done yet. She had proven herself once, but this world had no mercy. She couldn't afford to be complacent. The scarred man looked down at her, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You've earned a little more than just our attention," he said, turning away. The rest of the men followed, leaving Clara standing in the clearing, her hands still bound, her body aching from the fight. She had made it through this test. But she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Clara stood in the clearing, the weight of the fight still settling in her bones. Her hands were raw from the ropes, her body aching from the violence she had just been thrust into. But as the men around her began to disperse, she realized something that sent a shiver down her spine. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She had passed the test, survived it, but the real battle was just beginning. The scarred man had walked away from her with a slight nod of acknowledgement, but the look in his eyes lingered in Clara's mind. It wasn't respect, it was something else, something far darker. She had proven herself in his eyes, but now the expectation would be even greater. Morrison had watched her fight, his face as cold as ever, but this time, Clara noticed a flicker of something else, something unreadable. It was almost as if he was impressed. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean for her future in this camp, under his control? The men who had surrounded her now moved away, retreating to their own business. But Clara felt no relief. She had earned her place in their eyes, but it was not a place she wanted. Not really. As the camp slowly came back to life, Clara walked back toward the fire, her movements stiff with the effort of holding everything inside. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up this charade. The violence, the fear, the constant struggle, it was breaking her in ways she couldn't explain. She had survived the fight, but the cost was higher than she had anticipated. She had given up everything to save her father, but now, she was beginning to understand that survival came with its own price. She had fought to prove she was strong, but now, the weight of that strength was crushing her. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. The quiet of the camp, once so welcome, now felt suffocating. The fire crackled in front of her, the flames dancing like memories she couldn't quite grasp. The men who had watched her fight were already talking again, their voices low and rough, but Clara couldn't focus on them. All she could hear was the sound of her own breath, the pounding of her heart, the realization that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. "Clara," Morrison's voice interrupted her thoughts, his voice as cold and distant as ever. She turned to face him, and for the first time, there was something almost like an acknowledgement in his eyes. "You've done well," he said, his voice low but steady. Clara didn't know how to respond. She wanted to lash out, to scream at him, to ask him why he had dragged her into this world of violence and cruelty. But instead, she just nodded. She didn't have the energy for confrontation. Not now. "But don't get comfortable," Morrison continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're not out of the woods yet." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the familiar knot of fear form in her stomach. What did he mean? What was coming next? "What do you want from me now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison didn't answer immediately. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You'll learn soon enough," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that sent a chill through Clara. Just remember, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone by the fire. She watched him go, the sense of foreboding growing inside her. She had thought she was done, that she had proven herself, but now, she understood the truth. There would never be an end. This life, this world of violence and survival, would never let her go. It would consume her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the shell of the woman she had once been. Clara's chest tightened as she turned back toward the fire. The flames flickered, casting shadows across her face, and for the first time, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. The fight had changed her. It had changed everything. And as she stared into the fire, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living this way. She had to find a way out. But how? The camp was her cage, and Morrison was the key. But the more Clara thought about it, the more she realized that escaping wasn't going to be as simple as just walking away. If she wanted to leave this place, if she wanted to take control of her life again, she would have to outsmart Morrison, outfight him, and face whatever dangers came her way. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not like before. She had learned how to fight. And now, she would learn how to survive in a world where survival meant losing a part of yourself every day. As the night deepened and the camp settled into uneasy silence, Clara knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She had survived the first test, but the real fight, her true fight, had just begun. In this gripping tale of survival, the harsh world of Western stories unfolds as Clara, a woman caught in the brutal grip of a lawless world, must navigate the dangerous terrain of moral choices, survival, and sacrifice. As she makes her way through a camp filled with ruthless men, Clara faces challenges that test her strength, resolve, and spirit. From proving her worth in a violent test of survival to dealing with the complex relationship with Morrison, a man whose cold demeanor and expectations push her to her limits, Clara's journey reveals the darker side of Western stories, where every choice has a price. The tension in these Western stories builds as Clara's fight for survival becomes a battle not just for her life, but for her very identity. Her struggle to retain her humanity in a world that demands cruelty is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. With each passing moment, Clara must choose whether to embrace the darkness surrounding her or fight to preserve the person she once was. The intensity of the Western stories takes a turn as Clara realizes that survival comes at a cost, and the price of staying alive may be more than she can bear. In the end, she must decide whether to continue in the world she has been thrust into or find a way out before it consumes her completely. These Western stories are a stark reminder of the harsh realities of life in the wild, where trust is earned, and every moment could be your last. Clara's journey is not just a fight for survival, but a search for redemption in a world where the line between good and evil is often blurred.